conscience of humanity against the excesses of Vietnam War and the excesses committed by a global power. Those were highlighted by some intrepid academics, and the issues were framed very clearly. Those human rights issues had echoes, whatever is happening in Kashmir now. And I'm sure as we go down that route, we will build up and follow up on whatever the Russell Tribunal is doing. So coming back to Pakistan and Gulf relations. So these relations are very old and abiding, and these are embedded in our politics, in our culture, in our history, in our economy as well. Pakistan has spent not only blood, but also the brain and brawn, both combined to contribute tangibly towards the Gulf economies. And Pakistan and Gulf countries, they are bound by filial ties, and there is a fraternity that we associate with, despite the boundaries of Arab, Ajam, non-Arabs, and other Muslim countries. There has always been a very strong undercurrent of affection for Gulf countries in Pakistan. One of the strengths of Pakistan is its human resource, a very large population, and very, in many ways, it has the capability of providing manpower, both at second tier and the first tier. Now we know that what started with small migrations to Oman in 40s in the services sector, and the countries like Iraq and Saudi Arabia, it expanded into a construction workforce in 50s and 60s, and followed by expert workforce, which is branching into services, into high-tech things. Now we have our diaspora, which is in banking, which is in medicine, which is in engineering, which is in even social work and entrepreneurship. So I think this is a leverage that Pakistan has, and this is a tie that we need to further capitalize upon. Pakistan's politics has also been intimately linked, because our ideological persuasion was with the causes like Palestine, we championed the cause of Palestinians very boldly and vociferously on all the forums, despite our own issues here in Pakistan. And sometimes we paid the high price, but such price is of no consequence when it comes to the national interests and values that bind a bigger community that we call the Muslim Ummah. The Gulf countries, sometimes it's difficult to distinguish what is GCC and what is the Gulf countries, because there are countries which are not part of GCC, like Palestine, like Iraq, like Egypt. But still, once we talk of Gulf, all these countries come into consideration. So today, one aspect is the politics, one aspect is the security relationship, one aspect is the economic and other possibilities, because they say that blood is thicker than water, but sometimes in this world, economics, trade, and realpolitik, they trump those ideological considerations, and Pakistan should be equally cognizant of those realities and leverage and capitalize upon our strengths so as to develop a long-lasting bond of brotherly relations as well as economic relations. We know here that nowadays the Abrahamic Accords and the new Quad that is developing, the world is seized with those issues. India, United States, UAE, and Israel, they've formed a new organization which is Quad Plus. So that Quad Plus, it might have different objectives, it might have different aims. Welcome, Doctor. But it has the echoes of that Quad, which is Japan, Australia, India, and which has adversarial connotation to contain the China's maritime interests into Indo-Pacific. So that is why sometimes in Pakistan we view the new emerging Quad with a lot of trepidation, and I'm sure many of our panelists are much more capable to enlighten us on those aspects as to what do we actually need to be concerned about through this emerging Quad, and what is the impact of the Abrahamic Accords on the security, economic relations between us and the Gulf countries. I'm sure Farhan would touch upon those themes in his discourse. So without much ado, I would like to welcome the first speaker on the podium to come and regale us on a very important aspect of emerging security dynamics in the wake of Abrahamic Accords concerning Pakistan and the Gulf countries. So over to you, Mr. Farhan.
So first, sabko salam kehna chahta hu. And I want to thank Brigadier Janjua for inviting me here today to share my thoughts on Pakistan-Gulf relations. And as I was listening to him, many things struck me as very important. The multi-level dimensions of Pakistan's relationship with the Gulf that has not been entirely fully explored nor effectively exploited. And just to kind of give people an example, you know, the name the Gulf within the region, I've been living there now for almost 14 years. The Gulf region is always referred to as either the Arabian Gulf or the Persian Gulf. In the literature, in the field, there is this competition of defining the region, either as a Persian Gulf or an Arabian Gulf. In that, you can see there is this kind of competitiveness. And majority of the literature will tend to side with this characterization as the region as the Persian Gulf, which is interesting because if that's done, then with the population of Iran as it is and the tiny population of the Gulf Arabs as it are, then it's no longer really going to be effectively representing the people at the helm of affairs within the GCC, strictly the GCC countries, which include, of course, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, Bahrain, Qatar, UAE, right? So this is important to give us a background towards some of the competition that is happening in the region. But in another way, the formation of the GCC itself is very critical to look at. And I know the time is limited. I'll try to touch on many of these issues. And if anyone had any further questions, I'll be more than happy to respond in detail. But I wanted to give these introductory remarks first to describe the Gulf in itself and the competition behind it, and then the role of Gulf in global politics. You know, it's a relationship between the core and the periphery, how it operates very much as a manager, all right? And between this almost master-slave relationship, these are the subservient second tier to global powers. And then that global power is premised on its ability to manipulate and to control and to offer countries like Pakistan their ability to canvass the world in their leadership, alleged leadership ability, by saying we can bring Pakistan along. So I think that's also a fundamentally important prism to realize, and for Pakistanis themselves to realize the role sometimes that others are playing at your behest, and how not to undercut yourself. The importance of this country, not just as Brigadier Janju had mentioned, in the banking industry, at the forefront of the entire Gulf region. And Gulf capital is an extremely important part of global capitalism. And that excess money that is offered to countries like the US and UK in particular. So just the role in which the Gulf plays, and there's almost internally, officially, a denial recognition of this South Asian Muslim component within the Gulf. You know, there's a very interesting, and there's two things a part of that. There's a sustained campaign almost to discredit Pakistan. And we've only recently become to like officially acknowledge this when you look at the Disinformation Lab that released this report about the more than 100 and I think it was 140 websites approximately. Those are the ones they opened that were just for the last almost 2 decades incessantly insulting Pakistan, discrediting. Like, this is almost unheard of, the level of hubris and the level of hatred that's being reflected towards Pakistan. But it's very ingrained. And all these points that I'm mentioning now are going to be extremely relevant when we come to the main topic of the Abraham Accords, right? So I would like everybody to keep these in mind about the level of the hatred that particular intelligentsia, whether it's on the Congress side or Hindutva side, Hindutva is just more manifest towards the very being of Pakistan and how that's reflected within the Gulf. So there is upwards of approximately, and it ranges differently, between 35 to 40% of the population, of the entire population of the GCC has some South Asian component. It's never, though, acknowledged officially. When you speak to local Qataris, what's interesting, no Qatari house can be a Qatari house without keema, without paratha, without pulka, and chapati. I'm not exaggerating. These are terms they use in their houses for food they make, and they acknowledge the origin of it. There is somewhat a kind of loose acknowledgement also of the so many people of, you know, even of Pakistan originally that have now citizenship within the region. But it's always underrepresented, whether that's in Oman, where the community can, some estimates vary, and this is where estimates become very political, upwards of 30% of the population. You know, when I first entered Qatar, I got by not through Arabic or English, but through Urdu, because all the police officers spoke it. Everyone at immigration spoke it. So that gives you an idea of the immense kind of cultural, social cultural role that the Muslims of this region had in the development of at least particular Qatar, but the entire GCC in general, as anyone who looks very carefully can easily quite see. So there is that role. There is also a recognition of a sustained campaign to discredit Pakistan in ways to constantly kind of characterize it as duplicitous, unprincipled, untrustworthy. And some of my efforts have been throughout the years is to counter that. And what I found was extremely warm, positive perspective towards the people of Pakistan at the street level. So while there may be a sustained campaign at a, let's say, at an elite level, and that too needs to be split between civil and military because they do absolutely make this distinction. But at the street level, there's a very positive understanding towards Pakistan and its vision and its future. And I'm witness to that positive attitude, not just within Qatar, by the way, in Saudi Arabia, absolutely. But again, at the street level. So this is something that I think that Pakistan should build more effectively on. I'll give you one more example before I go into the depth of the content of the Abraham Accords, was that when I went in 2008, when I first moved to Qatar, I was with the Deputy Ambassador of Pakistan to Qatar, and there was a Qatari minister there. And the deputy head of the mission complained about why Pakistanis are not getting more visa applications to send more Pakistanis. At that time, when I went, there was 79,000 Pakistanis in Qatar. Now, and he was in a state of shock. He was surprised that this question was coming. He said, Your Excellency, what are you talking about? He said that we have several dozen different nationalities here in Qatar. And everyone, they're very organized, by the way, extremely organized. So every single community, any relationship they have with employee relations or with the labor force, it's all documented. And the least complaints being made by any single community in Qatar, the least number of complaints is by the Pakistanis. And the other communities, they're in the tens of thousands. Complaints against their work conditions, complaints against their employer. But with the Pakistanis, he was stunned that the deputy head of the mission was asking this question. He goes, they're the best workers we have. Now, at the current time, in Qatar alone, there is currently about 180,000 Pakistanis. And there was an announcement a while ago, additional 60,000 skilled workers will be traveling there, which will make it approximately, you know what I mean? You're looking at about 240, depending on the final count, 240 to 50,000. From 13 and a half years ago, that's a substantial improvement in relations. So behind this is also this kind of, you know, a better recognition of how we can put forward our agenda in the region and not be led by the region. I believe Pakistan at times was in that position. It wanted to be led by the region. It kind of subscribed to that idea. And that was, I believe, a mistake. That region hardly can lead itself, or they're too small to be effective to lead a much broader region, or, as His Excellency mentioned, the Mr. Janjua, the Ummah. Now, coming to the more, so I just wanted to give and share my thoughts of what I've been experiencing there, and the warmth. They do not have this negative attitude towards non-Arabs. And that's another thing that a lot of people tend to see, tend to exaggerate. I believe this is also intentional. And I think this is so important for us to realize the ways that our emotions and feelings can be manipulated by other people that do not want Pakistan to be more intertwined within the Arab world, within the Central Asian world, within North Africa or Eastern Europe, where we would have natural allies. That there's an attempt to create these ethnic, exaggerated realities to prevent it. And this is not just isolated with Pakistan and the Arab world, same thing with Turkey and the Middle East. Keep them under a wider umbrella of Turkey with Europe that will never accept it, Pakistan under India that will never accept you. So these are the larger kind of geopolitical, cultural games that are being played that unfortunately many of us are unknowingly perhaps or knowingly subscribing to. So all that being said, coming to the Abraham Accords, and when I was approached with this topic, to be honest, I was a little uneasy. The thought of something that I believe would be so devastating and detrimental towards Pakistan's future and long-term strategic stability, long-term, I thought, why is someone even talking about something that should be so clear as this? But nonetheless, you know, we can talk about everything, and we should be able to systematically and very methodically put things forward and then step back and think, okay, what would be the benefits of such a so-called deal? And, you know, I wanted to start with a little kind of narration, because in my experience, not only have I, you know, ran in politics in Canada and I worked at the United Nations, and also, you know, I've studied it my whole life. So I wanted to kind of give a narration of important lessons to share, especially with the young scholars today for their future on principles, right? I want to share two examples with you to give you insight on something that many of us may be kind of inclined towards not to consider, which is the role of the principles and your values in this chaotic, anarchic, realpolitik world. Although that's what it champions, it's not what it respects. That's what it talks about in the academic literature, but that is not the literature. That is the literature that belongs to our civilization or our people, that Machiavellian two-faced reality. That is not something that you should cherish, admire, or look towards as an icon towards which you should work towards or admire. So wonders will never cease. From isolation to adoration, fear to courage, chaos to order. No one could have plausibly predicted such good fortune when Qatar was threatened by a bona fide military invasion by its neighbor. The accusations, amidst those accusations, supporting terror, regional isolation, and a global superpower prodding your regional nemesis into actually crushing you, tweeting the same and joking about it during Ramadan. That amongst all this, Qatar stood its ground and now, years later, has completely repositioned itself as perhaps the most stable country in the region. So I share that with you to take a close look at how it happened, and then to draw parallels of whether or not we should even be entertaining the idea of the Abraham Accords. Now, what Qatar was asked to do really, and behind this Gulf entanglement, is an ideological entanglement. And that ideological entanglement really rests on the role of popular representative governance that is in line with the values and civilizations of its people, and those that are against this popular representative value-based order to impact the politics of the region. And people can characterize it any way to kind of cheapen it or to insult it, to diminish it. They can call it Muslim Brotherhood versus a Salafi order. They can call it monarchy versus democratic, but none of these are actually accurate. What it really is a characterization of people's values having an input in the governance of a society. And should that be in line? Should your leadership be in line with the values of its society? And what you see anywhere when leadership of a society's values is not in line with the common understanding and values of society, you have instability. And then that leadership is illegitimate and almost always authoritative. So to keep its control, it needs to repress. And Pakistan should never be on the side of repression as a principle. So that's what's behind the scenes. And when His Highness Sheikh Tamim was confronted with these assertions during the height of the crisis in 60 minutes, he was asked point blank, well, Your Highness, you have Taliban there. You have Hamas in Qatar. You have dealings with Iran. So is it not true you are supporting terror? And he was extremely cool and calm about it. He turned around and he said, well, Americans told us to have it. That's really interesting. And what I loved about it was that it was so brutally honest. And many people might get a little bit scared. At that time, your country's under threat. It's very normal. You know, we see today what's happening in Ukraine. The threat of war is ever present. So at that time, he said, without blinking an eye, America told us to have Hamas chapter here. America was the one that said, let's have a Taliban office here and bring in Qatar as the mediator. In a way, they were unhappy with what Pakistan was doing. And in the end, they have to come back anyway. But to say it bluntly, what everybody knew behind the scenes takes courage and truthfulness. And in the end, the entire topic of terror stopped. There was no more news reports on that. So truth and courage helped. It's not just one. I'll give you many examples when you study this. The same thing happened during the Bosnian War, in which Haris Selajic was approached by members of the Israeli Jewish American lobby that, do you support Palestine? And he said, yes. They said, good. We wouldn't trusted you if you said no. This is a true story that he told me. So, you know, there's a deep wisdom in selling your cleverness and trying to think you can outmaneuver everybody. Now, finally, I don't want to take too much time, but I did want to touch on the Abraham Accords. And there's several myths, right? And I kind of characterize the myths as running along, you know, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. And when your standard is already so low, then somebody will come with anything that seems to be so, out of the box and breaking free. But in reality, it's just the one-eyed man. This myth, the false promise of normalization and the myth of the Abraham Accords, a lot of it is just a publicity stunt. You can see very closely, if you look at it, that originally, August 13, I believe it was exactly when the first joint statement was made. And then September 15 is when the signing was done in Washington. And what people usually describe as an Arab issue, it is anything but. This is not an Arab issue, first of all. And even if we were to accept that, what percentage of the 22 Arab countries have actually decided that they will normalize? So how could we say Arabs are giving up, Pakistan should too? In fact, right now we have only a handful of countries, and some of them are walking back from it. So you have UAE and you have Israel openly, you have Jordan, you have Morocco loosely, Sudan walked back, walked forward, walked back again, now has to repeal certain laws, and they've only repealed one. It's not something that happens whimsically overnight, because in so many of their constitutions, like in Pakistan's passport, clearly says that this passport is invalid for Israel. So these are not decisions that can be whimsically done overnight and changed. Likewise, throughout the entire Middle East, the first to characterize it as an Arab issue is false, because out of the 22 Arab countries and the 400 plus million Arabs that belong to the Arab League, I would argue, even if you take in the full populations of the countries that are signing it, it'd be less than 30%. So 70% of Arab official society, and I would go even higher, is against it. And the Arab street is totally against it. So who should Pakistan back on? Transient leadership, and 20 years is transient, or long-term respect on principle? Again, it's not a Palestine issue. It is an international law issue to which we use to justify our stance on Kashmir and the crimes that are against there. Again, by principle, because if you don't abide and respect international law, then you are very much in a jungle. And then it is a justice human rights issue. So when you look at it from all these perspectives, then it becomes quite clear that, and really, what are the advantages? Absolutely nothing. Really. And you can even see this in how the UAE was treated immediately after signing it, that its acquisition of the F-35 was blocked. Now you tell me, what game? And that's Israel, that's opening up the embassies. So a lot of this is hot air. And you might start to think that, oh, I'm going to stop having such and such person as an enemy. But they will not stop viewing you as an enemy. They will not stop viewing Pakistan's nuclear military know-how as an enemy. So please do not remain in any illusions that you could open this door and everything will be fine, and they're going to stop thinking as you as a threat. They don't. And they always will consider Pakistan amongst the real threats in the broader Middle East region as a competitor, as they will always view Turkey as a real threat. Now, of course, there's so much else that I can touch on, but I just wanted to kind of give those ideas on the implausibility of where the Abraham Accords, really what it has not even achieved, how it's such a minuscule segment of Arab society. And again, look, everybody will look at the world through a particular prism that they've embodied. And I admit that I'm looking at it through a competition of haqq and batil. I accept this characterization. Other people might look at it for what is my sole strategic interest at a given time. And other people may look at it in a different way. And I acknowledge there's multiple ways of looking any conflict or any tension. Or the future, for that matter, the future of a country. But I am telling you how I'm exactly looking at it, and that's premised on international law, premised on the reality that countries need to work together and respect each other as equals, and if they don't, they should be held accountable. Thank you very much, everybody, for patiently listening, and I will take my seat now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khan, for your remarks. Next up, I'd like to invite Dr. Vakar for his presentation on Pakistan-Gulf economic relations and future avenues. Sir.
Thank you very much. It's certainly a pleasure to be here. Apologies that I was late driving all the way from Peshawar in the morning. It's certainly a tall order to come after Dr. Farhan, and it was a very powerful presentation. So thank you very much for that. And certainly it's... Let me start by thanking Dr. Farhan and team. And I'm also, of course, honored to be sharing this panel with some very esteemed colleagues over here. I have a very short presentation here, just outlining what our current economic relations are, and possibly presenting a way forward. And I'm sure that my other esteemed colleagues would be in a better position to sort of expand on some of the economic opportunities that exist between the GCC and Pakistan. So maybe we can just expand the next. Let me start by... So very briefly, I've taken some numbers on trade relations, investment cooperation, migration and remittances, aid flows. And then, of course, I offered that while things are, of course, looking promising, however, there is a very stiff competition in the Gulf, which Pakistan is currently facing, and one would need to be very prepared for this. And before I go into the actual numbers, let me also present my 2 cents on the brief macroeconomic situation that Pakistan faces. I think coming out of COVID and adhering to a very tough IMF program, the country is in case of most macroeconomic fundamentals, they seem stable. As we say that the vitals are stable. Of course, there is a global inflationary effect that is affecting us as well. And I think in the days to come, what is important is that this impact from global inflation, which is hitting domestic inflation as well, adding pressures on exchange rate as well, should not impact the gains which have been made in the real sector, particularly agriculture sector, which is showing booming production this year. In many of the crop sectors, we have hit record high levels. Exports, because Pakistan was able to open up relatively quickly compared with peer economies in the COVID period. So the exports numbers have been very promising. So one needs to sort of be very careful that in the days to come, inflation, exchange rate management should aim to sort of aid those macroeconomic variables which have been progressing well. Next. I think very quickly. Next. So in terms of our trade relations, UAE remains by far the largest exporting destination of Pakistan. And there is, of course, potential for increase in other GCC countries. We have seen numbers increasing, but of course, those numbers haven't increased as much as they've increased in the case of UAE, for example, over time. Of course, one of the reasons is because UAE has a much more liberal and deregulated market, which helps countries such as Pakistan. Also because Pakistan is able to use facilities at UAE for re-export to other countries as well, which also helps our private sector over here, particularly the small and medium enterprise segment, SMEs who cannot sort of bear large-scale costs of warehousing. They tend to sort of utilize those costs, those facilities over here in UAE for re-exporting purposes. However, of course, in case of other GCC countries, both government as well as private level efforts would be desired. We'll briefly touch upon them in a short while. Post-COVID has actually seen buyer requirements increase in terms of sanitary and phytosanitary conditions, health and hygiene conditions, which our private sector would need to adapt to. This is not just applicable to our food, agriculture, or processed food exports. It's also applicable to our largest export, which is textile and garments. So post-pandemic, we are seeing more stringent requirements which private sector would have to adapt, and of course, this also adds to some cost of doing business as well. Now, demand analysis based on future trends in these countries indicates the potential of non-traditional exports, if I may say. So it's the reliance on garment and textile really has to go now. And it's good that the government has recently passed the Strategic Trade Policy Framework, which is a 3-year trade policy framework, gives certain incentives to non-traditional exports as well, which are much desired in GCC countries. Next, please. We have seen some surge in services exports as well, however, not so much in the GCC region. So while our services exports have seen an increase in EU region, in North American region, even to select countries in the Far East as well, we haven't seen a large increase in services exports to GCC, something which needs to be diagnosed. IT and ICT services, which have broken all past records during the past 2 years, have seen rising exports. However, in the case of GCC, more secure online payment systems are a key demand of those vendors who are dealing with us in the GCC region, plus those who want to enter into JVs in ICT and ICT. They would like to see the 3 important policy frameworks pending at Ministry of IT and Telecom passed early, including the broadband policy, cloud computing policy, and the framework related to online privacy. Next, please. So as I said, most of the exports that we are sending in most of the countries are very sort of, if we can call them primary exports, very traditional exports, more so related to low value added goods, by low value added goods, almost tilting towards raw materials, So even if you look at top 5 exports to any of the GCC countries, we are not in the value chain of medium tech or high tech. And it's not that we are not producing in medium tech or high tech. We just need to make sure that we get the same kind of market access that we have in the US market, for example, in the EU. It's more about negotiating with these countries at the moment. Next. Now, imports from GCC, of course, we are heavily reliant on our oil and gas requirements at an industry and household level. But more recently, with the State Bank of Pakistan's facility called TURF, which was a temporary refinance facility, we have seen that manufacturing sectors also started sourcing a lot of high-end inputs from GCC countries as well, which have seen rising numbers in fiscal year 20 and 21. Of course, as I said, that JVs present a great potential. There is interest. We have seen Board of Investment engage in much larger number of delegations, at least 3 of which have culminated into very good medium-term business deals. However, I still feel, and this I'll also, once I reach the conclusion slide, I'll also conclude with this, there's a better presentation of special economic zones, which we need to do in the GCC market. Not many of those clients over there, actually potential clients over there, know about the mega investment that we are making across the 9 SEZs or the 3 priority SEZs. Next, please. In terms of investment relations, once again, UAE remains the top origin of both direct investment and portfolio investment in Pakistan. While, of course, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Qatar, that potential remains untapped. There are studies by STPI, PIDE, Prime Institute, which indicate the sector-wise potential that exists in these 3 countries. However, more outreach initiatives incentives would be required, including now that we are entering into post-pandemic requirement. One should go back to the in-person B2B linkages that Trade Development Authority of Pakistan, TDAP, has or used to have, for example, and maybe look beyond UAE as well. Fourth, we have been shying away from opening our investment regime for outward investment. Still, for example, many of the investors who come to Pakistan, they are reluctant to engage in longer term contracts because they fear that whether they'll be able to pull out their profits and principal amount in time or not. We have seen the example of Lafarge, for example, recently, who wanted to repatriate the capital after selling their units to Egyptians. And the amount was only $300 million, but it actually took Pakistan 7 months of approval, after which Lafarge could take out that money. So that sort of non-ease in capital inflows sort of sends shivers down the spines of our foreign investors. Second, of course, the one window provision that we continue to promise, it's still not there. While, of course, some of the provinces have cashed up, maybe if I could say Punjab and KP, but Sindh and Balochistan and Gilgit-Baltistan, while they have been doing their investment expos, but a fair feedback from those investors who have been engaging is that one window doesn't extend to all of the Pakistan, at least those of the provisions that we have, something where I think we can learn from peer economies as well. Next, please. Remittances, Saudi Arabia and UAE, of course, will continue to remain the largest hosts of Pakistani workers, at least for now. But recent studies by NAVTEC have shown that low knowledge base is still preventing entry of Pakistani workers into higher skilled jobs. And I can relate this to Dr. Farhan's presentation as well, where I think he was making a very powerful case that the people-to-people sentiments are there, and that's because you find a lot of Pakistani workers in those low-skilled market segment where they're able to interact with the population at large. The entry into higher-end market or higher-end job market, if I can say, requires not just increased skills level, but also improved diplomatic efforts. Recently, of course, Malaysia signed dedicated labor supply contracts for high-end workers with Qatar and UAE, something, a template that Pakistan could look into. And the certification programs compared to peers are still weak, where, of course, we need to work even for the low-end workers as well. There's a supply constraint as well. So we've only been able to supply 1/10 of what Qatar had initially asked us for the FIFA World Cup, for example. So it's only 1/10 of the supply that has been secured. The demand from Qatar is, of course, still there. Next, please. In terms of aid flows, of course, GCC, apart from Saudi Arabia, still remains, of course, one of the lower contributors. Saudi Arabia has two forms of aid inflows. One, of course, is the short-term loan, which has been provided for stabilizing our foreign exchange reserves at the state bank. This is overall to the tune of $3.2 billion. But they also have project-based lending to Pakistan as well, particularly in hydropower and water supply schemes. And these are part of the PC1s that go into our public sector development program, through which, of course, that aid is routed. There are minor contributions from Kuwait, Oman, and UAE, mostly in the social sector. Next, please. So my final slide is that in terms of B2B engagement recently, it was heartening to see Pakistan's presentation at the Dubai Expo, one of the best as per UAE's own assessment, of course, provided a good model avenue to project Pakistan's comparative advantages. But as I said, UAE is already up there as the largest trading and investment cooperator with Pakistan. One needs to have such sort of avenues in Qatar, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia, which are the other three countries that present that potential. And maybe as pandemic subsides, TDAP would need to increase its B2B engagements over there as well. The potential of SEZs, as I said, is still not better presented for Gulf region. Each each of the special economic zones senior management should be asked to deliver dedicated presentations based upon their own provinces and provincial context in these Gulf countries. Value chain integration should be the core component for future FTA, free trade agreement, with Gulf countries. There is already a pending draft of FTA with GCC, something, at least in my personal view, Ministry of Commerce should strongly pursue. There are differing views whether Pakistan's local industry sets to gain or not, but if one thinks about it really dispassionately, FTAs do lead to exchange of knowledge, ideas, and technology which otherwise are not accessible to you. And if those FTAs have investment clause as well, the automatic route investment helps your private sector as well. Finally, the PRMI, Pakistan Regulatory Modernization Initiative, which has been initiated under this government, of course, needs to be expedited. And of course, this follows the Dubai template of a one window in many of the sectors, something I think which even if we can sort of deliver some parts of PRMI like Pakistan's single window, if we can deliver some parts of it even this year, I think there could be a quick growth recovery, growth spike this year, which will have, of course, favorable implications for jobs as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bakar. I'd like to now invite Ambassador Ghulam Dastagir for his presentation.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Let me thank Brigadier Danjua and Ambassador Asif Durrani for inviting me to this institute. This is my first visit to the institute, and I'm really have a very good learning from the previous two speakers who spoke on different aspects on economic Pakistan Gulf economic relations, as well as the new developments followed by the Abraham Accord. Let me briefly touch on the Middle East Accord. In fact, before going through this accord, let me explain that most of the Gulf countries, they did have the informal contacts with Israel, like Qatar, Oman. They had the interest offices established there. They were having interaction with Israel, and the Israeli Prime Minister also visited Oman, although they do not have diplomatic relations. So there are some other countries which have interaction with Israel before that. So there was some speculation a couple of years back that UAE especially, and maybe one or two other countries from Gulf, they will have diplomatic relations, they will recognize Israel, and ultimately in 2020, when this news, you see, was flashed, and it was not a surprise for many, including Pakistan. It was not a surprise, because UAE was giving signal for quite some time that we should rather following the path of fighting with the enemy, with Israel, perhaps we can follow the peace path, and which they declare that since we could not achieve the objectives in the last 40-50 years, and perhaps we can shift to the peace accord, perhaps we can achieve that objective. So in that background, the Abraham Accord was signed, and that was primarily to recognize Israel and having normal diplomatic relations with Israel. So followed by that, both countries, Israel and UAE, they had diplomatic missions established. They had exchange of delegations, and obviously when the delegation from Israel was coming to UAE, they need special permission from Saudi Arabia to have the airspace use, and Saudi Arabia's permission to these Israeli planes to fly over is also an indication that there was an implicit understanding from Saudi Arabia to the UAE and Bahrain to have this kind of diplomatic relations with Israel. Followed by that, you see, then there is interaction between these three countries, trilateral interaction, Israel, US, and UAE. And then the Indian, you see, you can say the interest to join them. And that is also worrisome for us in different aspects, that Israel has already diplomatic relations with India. But when they join hands, then perhaps there are a number of interests which our interest in Gulf will definitely have, you see, impact on that. So when they had the meeting in October in 2021, and primarily they agreed to operationalize the economic relations and also to normalize not only the operationalization and normalization of Abraham Accord, and that was the focus on economic interaction and the investment and the trade and especially you see the technology and transportation, these areas. So but primarily they gave the indication that we are looking for more economic opportunities rather than going for a security. But maritime security is also part of that. So that also covered to some extent the defense area. So this new Quad also, you see, has the undertone of a containment to the China, like you see the Quad has earlier the Japan, Australia on that side also. So this is also an area which has some implication for us. Next. So New Delhi has expanded its contact with the UAE, and Israel is already there. And now the worry which is India used to have, that if we have closer relations with Israel, then the Arab countries may not be very happy with us. But since the Arab countries are having interaction with Israel, so they are now much more satisfied that whatever interaction we have with Israel, there will be no reaction, there will be no negative implication from the Arab side. So that's there. So they are also very keen to take advantage of Abraham Accord and have deeper engagement with Israel and the Arab countries. So this is the primarily the background of Middle East Accord. I think everyone is aware. Next. Now I come to the relations between Pakistan and Gulf. Very detailed, Dr. Waqar has mentioned about the Pakistan's relations, the economic relations with the Gulf countries. Pakistan has historically, we have very close relations with almost all Gulf countries. Politically, we have very close relations. We have very good interaction with the leadership with almost all countries. Frequent visits are taking place between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, and I know that for the last 2-3 years there is, maybe because of this pandemic, the level of engagement is less than it used to be. Before the pandemic, we had quite frequent visits to these countries, and for the last 2 years, I think, except the Prime Minister has undertaken a visit, 1 or 2 visits to Saudi Arabia, and he has not undertaken any visit to other Gulf countries, including UAE. Foreign Minister has, yes, he has undertaken a few visits, but again, the engagement was limited. But he has undertaken visit to Kuwait before pandemic, and also he has visited Bahrain, and I think he has visited Oman. So there was interaction, but at the foreign minister level, not the prime minister level. Similarly, from the Gulf side, very limited visits were materialized. I think the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, he came to Pakistan immediately after the PTI government took over. And there was indication that perhaps the Saudi Arabia is very keen to have investment in Pakistan. They announced $20 billion also that we will invest in different projects. But that still need to be seen, that on ground, I think there are still not visible signs that this investment is coming. Similarly, the Crown Prince of UAE visited, although he came to Ibrahim Yar Khan, but that opportunity was availed by Pakistan, that he was invited to Islamabad, and he had very good interaction with the government. He had a good rapport with the Prime Minister, and later on, off and on, they do have interaction over telephone. But let me mention that the Pakistan relations with UAE were not very good during the previous regime, the previous government in Pakistan, and that was a background of Expo 2020. And when this idea was coming up, so Pakistan somehow did not manage it well. Pakistan decided to support Turkey's bidding, and later on, Pakistan also supported UAE, but I think they did took note of it, and the UAE was very unhappy over Pakistan's decision to not to support UAE for the Expo 2020. And there was a time that we had a really bad patch with the UAE. When the new government came, and I remember that when Prime Minister was in UAE, the Crown Prince did mention to our Prime Minister that, look, we are host of over 1.7 million Pakistanis, and when you decided, your government decided to support Turkey, tell me how many Pakistanis are working in Turkey. So that was the message also given to the Prime Minister, that Gulf, the UAE is more important to Pakistan than any other country. So that is there. And then the economic relations, I think Dr. Waqar has quite in detail has elaborated. Our interest is there. Our trade is roughly $15 billion with these countries. And the remittance, again, our diaspora is 4.5 million in the Gulf. And I think more than 50% share in our total remittance is from the Gulf countries. So that's also very important for Pakistan, very important for Pakistan economy, that we have so much dependence on the remittances coming from the Gulf countries. So that aspect is very important for us. Then we have also, this is the major source of energy supply to Pakistan. We are importing not only the petroleum products, we are also having the LPG from the Qatar, from some other countries. So our this I think dependence will continue in the future, because our demand is increasing day by day for the petroleum products and the LPG, because our own gas resources are scarce, and now we have very limited supply from this. So that dependence will also continue in the near future. Investment, UAE and the Gulf countries, they are very keen to have investment in Pakistan. I remember when I was in Kuwait, when I was having a meeting with the president of the chamber, who was also very, very important personality, political wise in Kuwait. He did mention that Kuwait is also very keen to invest in Pakistan, because we have over $500 billion. We have our funds available, and from that we can divert to Pakistan. But we need concrete projects from your side. Your side, when they come, they do have very nice presentation. They highlights the incentives, but when we say, okay, bring us the projects, Pakistan side is not really coming up with the projects. So these were the ideas which I did also convey to the Board of Investment. And I think this is area where our side need to focus, that we need to come up with the concrete project, with feasibility studies, and then there are investors available in Gulf. So that area can be strengthened. Defense cooperation, we have very strong with all the Gulf countries, and I think this is the area which can be further strengthened. They do recognize Pakistan's contribution in the training of their armed personnel, not only one country, but I think across the board. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, and they do appreciate Pakistan's the contribution, and this is the area where we can further consolidate, further strengthen. Our diaspora is 4.5 million. I think that is the area where we can focus more, because rather than sending only labor, we should focus on high-end the labor for the manpower, especially in artificial intelligence is the area which is now coming up. We must focus on IT related and the highly skilled people, because one highly skilled are the professional may be equal to 10 the unskilled labor in terms of you see the salary, etc. So we can focus on that. OIC is also, again, from our point of view, is very important because we do take advantage, not only advantage, but rather we take the OIC is very important because the politically on issues like Kashmir, we do depend on their resolutions, we do depend on their support. So not only in Kashmir context, but OIC is a forum where we see other issues can be raised. So it's very important. The role of Gulf countries equally. You see, we need to also recognize that they are very, very important players in that, especially the Saudi Arabia and most of the Islamic countries. They do look towards Saudi Arabia whenever they take any decisions related to this region. Next. Now we have to look at the latest developments and its impact on Pakistan. Some points were raised by the previous speakers. I think the first area will be that we perhaps in the future may have some pressure from some friends to recognize Israel. It is not in the near future, but there is a feeling within Pakistan also that perhaps we should weigh our policy, whether we should continue with the current one, not to recognize Israel, or we can also show some flexibility, keeping in view the current scenario and the dynamism of the region. But again, here Pakistan's it's not easy for Pakistan to recognize Israel because Pakistan has a democratic society, Pakistan has a free media, and the public opinion is not in favor. Although it's divided, but majority is not in favor of taking such decision. Unlike Gulf, where whatever the decision is taken, they don't care about the public because there's no forum from where public can raise issues. Although when I remember when UAE decided to have diplomatic relations with Israel, some social media activists, they did, criticize, but I think those activists may not be sitting in UAE. Perhaps they are sitting outside because from inside it's not possible under their system because the surveillance is there, so they can't say anything which is not in line with the government. We also have similarities of Kashmir and Palestine. I think this is also very important that when we have a similarity, if suppose we change our stance on Palestine, then it will have impact on our stance on Kashmir. So I think this is also an area where we have to look at the policy options on that. Pakistani workers in future may have some pressure from the Gulf countries, especially because of economic relation between UAE, Israel, India, and perhaps later on some other Gulf countries. So our manpower will be under pressure that perhaps they will try to if not reduce, but they will try not to increase our manpower also. And then there are issues, security related issues can also be raised by these countries, including like Dr. Fran has also mentioned that the social media campaign is also going on that to malign Pakistan, and you see that so these factors will be there, and they will continue to put pressure on these countries, and so that it will have effect. Similarly, when they more have interaction with Israel, with more interaction with India, and the potential is there, Israel can provide technology, and India can provide investment, and India can provide the other supplies to Gulf. So means that our side will have disadvantage. Even currently, India has $60 billion trade with UAE, and we can well imagine that you see the volume of interaction, volume of trade, volume of you see economic relation, and they have planned to take it to $100 billion in a year or so. Similarly, investment is huge. It's not one way; it's two way. From Indian side, there's a huge investment in UAE, and likewise from UAE there. Although they have an investment in Pakistan as well, but the volume is very, I think, low as compared to the Indian investment. Pakistan has a lot of investment, by the way, in UAE, and you will be surprised to see the figures. Billions of dollars private investment is there in UAE, especially in real estate. I think, if I'm not exaggerating, it's over $10 billion Pakistani has invested in Dubai and Sharjah and all these areas. You see the properties they have purchased it. So it's a parking also of ill-gotten money is also being parked there. So that aspect is there. So sometime because of this, if we try to you see bring somebody back, and we ask UAE government to cooperate with us for investigation through NAB, etc. So then we also have, you see, a slow response from the UAE side, because indirectly they're getting benefit of it. So that is there. India will also try to get the OIC membership or the observer status, not membership, but at least observer status, because they are trying. They know that OIC is not very important, but still, you see, politically they see that if they get the observer status, that is important. And they made different realms for foreign ministers meeting held in Abu Dhabi. And India was invited, and although most of the OIC countries, they were not very happy, but they invited them, and they provided a platform where they can speak to the OIC countries there. Israel having direct relations with the UAE has reached to our border. So that is also an aspect I think we need to see that earlier they were not there, and now they are there. They can watch, you see, they can have different activities through them, and so that aspect is there. Next. Now, way forward, I think most of the points I have touched upon, and we need to actively pursue our engagement with the Gulf countries. Perhaps we need to increase it. High-level visits are appreciated by the Gulf countries. Leadership to leadership relations are very important. They do value such contexts, and we should focus on, and we should avoid also knee-jerk reaction, and also sometimes ill-conceived statements, I will say, because we have damaged our relations with especially Saudi Arabia in the last 1 or 2 years, when our foreign minister made a statement, and he made a statement on television, so which was also not taken well on the other side, and he indirectly criticized Saudi Arabia for its role in the OIC context especially. And so we need to look at this. Whenever we take an initiative, we must see pros and cons. One example is the last year, the Kuala Lumpur summit. We withdrew at the last moment, although the Kuala Lumpur summit was, we were one of the supporter in the beginning. And when we were about to attend the summit, there were very strong reservation from the Saudi Arabia, and I think from not openly but behind the scenes UAE as well. So Pakistan decided not to participate. So that was also giving very, very wrong signal that Pakistan can be influenced by the actors, you see, whenever they want. So we should also, I think, these area we must see, analyze pros and cons, and then we should go for neutrality of relations with Turkey and Iran. Turkey is also the Gulf countries, they consider Turkey as the not very friendly, but they see that they come in competition. So sometimes they say that they are also again in the same old you see mindset. So they were in competition in Libya, and they were also, you see, having some relations. I remember that UAE and Turkey was having very bad patch of relations, and there was a time then perhaps the ambassadors were also being there was consideration that perhaps Turkey will withdraw its ambassador from UAE, but that didn't happen. But for the last few months, there is a positive development that the Crown Prince also visited Turkey. And later on, the Turkish president also had a short visit to UAE. So means that they are coming back to normalization of relations. Iran is considered as one of their, you say that enemy, and they have suspicion about Iran, the role of non-state actors, the role of proxies. So Gulf countries, they are really, some of them, they say that Iran is the bigger enemy than Israel. So this is also a feeling there. So I think that you see, we need to strike a balance as we are trying to do it already, but that need to be focused more, that the relations with Iran and Turkey should not be affecting our relations with the Gulf countries. In the economic area, I think special economic zones is an area where we can focus, and perhaps under the CPEC, we can offer some special zones to the Arab countries, and there is appetite for that. Perhaps they are willing to make an investment. And then the skilled labor, which I already mentioned, that we need to do, because our relations with Gulf countries for Pakistan, I think this is fundamentally it's important, and we must try to save these relations from the negative implications from other developments. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ambassador Dastagir, for your presentation. Now to speak on Pakistan's position in prevailing Gulf security situation, I'd like to invite Dr. Nazir Hussain to the podium, please.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you very much. I am grateful to the IPRI for giving me this opportunity. I'm especially grateful to Ms. Sarooj. She is correspondent to the Douche Valley. She is here. Although Russia just invaded Ukraine, I think you should have been there, but thank you for coming here. Ladies and gentlemen, I have just 3 points to make. No long speeches or data, etc. I'm a hardcore realist. I believe hardcore realities. So here are the hardcore 3 realities. Number 1, international relation dictum is no permanent friends and no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. So don't be fooling yourself. I'm sorry with the very blunt sayings, no ma. Nothing of the sort. It's just the country, the states. Number 1. Number 2, taking a dictum from a private meeting somewhere, Dr. Amna mentioned, and I repeat with her permission, the Arab Gulf states or the Gulf regimes or the Gulf kings are not under the baggage of the old history between the two states, two countries, two entities. Yes, we developed their air force, we developed their socio-economic developments, but today they are no more there, 30, 40, 50 years. Now they are princes who are not anymore relied on Pakistan. they are relied on high tech. One room, and they have contacts with London, Europe, Paris, New York, you call it, in one room. I think so many people have seen that. Number 3, let's also have a soul searching of ours. What we are sending, non-skilled workers, are they compatible to the Indians, to the Bengalis, to the other countries? We have a symmetrical relationship. We are not Rafiq, please. So they don't treat us Rafiq. Saudi Arabia putting $100 billion investment in India, and what here? So let's be very fair to us. At least this is a policy-making institute. We should call a spade and let them decide what to do. Otherwise, if we are just confining ourselves to data and different way forwards, then I think the policy-making is not being done properly. And thanks to Magresab, I'm often, so many of my friends, Ambassador Durrani, my junior, my colleagues, they know that how blunt I am. Now, having said these 3 things, let's have the realities, ground realities. Number 1, there are new actors. And there are 3-way war in the Middle East. The new actors are, as mentioned so many times, India is a new actor, Israel is a new actor, Turkey is a new actor, China is a new actor, Russia is a new actor. So where we put ourselves into whom's basket? 3-way contest. Saudi Arabia wants to be the leader, Turkey wants to be the leader, and Iran wants to be leader. Where are we? We're still undecided what to do. Playing the game. Okay, good enough. We have a public diplomacy. We have a lot of good friends in all Middle Eastern states. But what is the role and the behavior of the elite class? How they view us? How they behave with us? How they interact with us? Okay, good enough. We have billions of dollars of remittances coming from the Gulf states. But are we utilizing those? Where it is going? That's another story. And the last thing, before I come to the ground situation, do we have one unison voice vis-a-vis the Gulf states, vis-a-vis the foreign policy? भाई साहब आपकी इजाजत से यहाँ जो उठता है वो अपनी मुंह से जो मर्जी बात कर लेता है, कोई मसला नहीं। सऊदी नाराज हो जाए, ईरान नाराज हो जाए, जो मर्जी नाराज हो जाए। We don't follow the national security interest. अभी तो शुक्र है चलो निकल आया, जैसा तैसा भी उस पर हम बात नहीं करते, मोहित से पूछेंगे, अभी डिबेट करनी है हमने उस पर भी। But the problem is, if all and sundry are speaking on the same context in different dimensions, that what messages you are sending to the friend and the foes. So after having said this, let's discuss where Pakistan is situated in the current Middle Eastern scenario. While Russia has invaded Ukraine, it had already done that vis-a-vis Syria. Its strong presence in the Middle East, strong presence. The United States of America is retrieving from the Middle East. Now it's more focused again on Ukraine because its military-industrial complex does not work anymore. So it needs a new enemy, new foe. And as you know very well, I'm not shying away from saying this, Biden is being controlled by the military establishment in the United States of America. So definitely he will go for the MICs to get them profits, nothing else. So in the new front. The problem lays with us, where we are focused on. At the one hand, we are cherishing the long-standing friendship of the Chinese. The CPEC is the harbinger of change and regional connectivity, etc. But we don't recognize the Chinese and the Iranian potential of $25 billion for the next 6 years. We are not capitalizing on that. We are still not capitalizing on the Iranian offers to Pakistan in terms of gas, in terms of refinery, in terms of I'm sorry, we have been talking about these things. Look at China, look at Iran. They are giving you 200 megawatt of electricity for Gwadar. If they stop it today, who will provide you? वैसे सब नाराज ना हो जाए मेरे से, क्योंकि अक्सर मीटिंग में हो जाते हैं. So there are supplies coming from Qatar, etc., etc. But problem is that we don't have our house in order. We don't set priorities. We don't know where to look for. I don't want to go into semantics and the details, but the basic problem is that Pakistan's place is being replaced by India in the Middle East. Simple. In terms of diplomacy, in terms of economic, in terms of finances, in terms of their influence. I mean, I can say easily how the Qatari Air Force was developed, how the Bahraini Air Force was developed, how many Pakistanis, but what is their contribution now in current situation? Let's see, 30, 40, 50 years ago, yes, there was. Today, they are a full-fledged state. They are good that they are being declared the non-NATO ally of the United States of America. So they don't need your security umbrella. So here is Qatar and Turkey at the one hand, here's Israel and, I'm sorry to create this, Israel and Saudi Arabia at the other hand, and is Iran and China and Russia at the one hand. So where are we? We have all enemies because we don't want Iran to be our friend as Saudi Arabia would be antagonized. We don't want to enter into Turkey with the Turkey as Mr. Saab just mentioned, the Kuala Lumpur summit at the end, while our aircraft was to fly from here and here, it has a detour. It had to come back. So this is our foreign policy success. And I'm sorry, हमारे बच्चे बैठे हैं, रिसर्चर बैठे हैं, उनसे खुल के बातें अगर आप छुपाते रहेंगे, तो they won't become, हमारे पास स्टीरियोटाइप फिर एनालिसिस आएंगे आपके पास. So इसीलिए एकेडमिक्स को कभी भी आपने पॉलिसी मेकिंग में नहीं डाला. ग्रेटफुल टू मोहित कि अभी हमें पॉलिसी फॉरेन पॉलिसी में अब बेचारे हमारे जैसे 2, 3, 4 टीचर जिनका 30, 40 साल का तजर्बा है, भाई साहब मेरे भी बाल सफेद हो गए, अब कोई याद आ गया, अच्छा कुछ बताएं हम भी क्या करें. चक साहब यहाँ पे आए हैं कनाडा से, 40 साल कश्मीर पॉलिसी कौन चलाता रहा है? 40 साल अफगानिस्तान पॉलिसी कौन चलाता रहा है? खैर मैं अपनी बातें नहीं बताना चाह रहा. So this is the hard realities and I think there are opportunities. डॉक्टर आमना के लिए मैं कुछ छोड़े जा रहा हूँ. There are good opportunities. Pakistan must capitalize on that. If you're not capitalizing, if Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the Qatar and the Kuwait and other countries of the Gulf states, they are choosing their friends not because of religion and culture and history and language, just because of their national interest. So we should do the same thing. If you're not doing the same things, we are missing the train. मैं ये नहीं बताना चाहता या नहीं डिस्कस करना चाह रहा कि क्या $25 billion चाइनीज ईरानियन ट्रीटी इंपॉर्टेंट है या हमारा सी पैक इंपॉर्टेंट है. और सी पैक भी जो कुछ आप कर चुके हैं या कर रहे हैं वो भी पब्लिक फिगर्स में आना शुरू हो गया. सो आई थिंक देयर आर अपॉर्चुनिटीज, देयर आर चांसेस एंड ग्लैड दैट ब्रिगेडियर साहब हैज कन्वीन्ड दिस वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट टॉपिक. हमें कोई पॉलिसी इनपुट मिलना चाहिए, बट वंस एंड फॉर ऑल आई मस्ट रिक्वेस्ट ऑल ऑफ यू स्पीक ट्रुथ, speak what is the ground realities, and then based on that advise the government. Otherwise अगर आप, अब मैं इस पे नहीं बात करना चाह रहा, लेकिन बेटे साहब आपकी इजाजत से है कि नहीं, अब यूक्रेन का विजिट इस वक्त करना, बट ठीक है, इट वाज प्री प्लान, मैं नहीं कह रहा, इट वाज प्री प्लान, मैं नहीं कह रहा, बट वी आर इन अ वेरी वेरी डिफिकल्ट सिचुएशन. उधर से अमेरिका से मैसेजेस आ रहे हैं. So we have to be very careful because we are a tiny state. Tiny not in terms of the population and the territory and other resources, tiny states of our contribution in the regional security dynamics, our contribution in the international security dynamics. We don't, nobody cares. United States of America see us from the prism of Afghanistan. Iran see us in some other prism. So I think our house must be in order, politically and economically, first and foremost, and then we should call policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nazir Hussain. Now I'd like to invite the last speaker for this session, Dr. Rama Mahmood, who will speak to us on how Pakistan can be competitive in the Gulf region.
Assalamu alaikum. It's very hard to be the last speaker after such a high-profile panel, ambassador, economist, and a very seasoned, rather two seasoned academicians. And I may try, but it's very hard. But I have to discuss that how Pakistan can be relevant in the present scenario in Middle East. First, I would agree with Ambassador Durrani Sahab, as Dr. Sahab mentioned, that we are having hard debate in Middle East group sitting, and I 100% agree that we should not be involved in internal feuds of Gulf. Every country is a different entity. We are more focused on in Saudi Arabia and UAE because they are ally, and we are having large volume of trades, remittances coming from there, and obviously the religious ties with them. But I think that now the things have gone from religion, as Dr. Nazir mentioned, and as my other colleagues mentioned. Religion, though I have presented a paper on the role of religion in international politics in 100 Years Conference of School of Politics in IR. And that was all focused on the same fact that religion is used as an scapegoat in international relations. When you want to adopt a certain policy and you have to convince your people that why are you doing that, then you adopt religion. Otherwise, you see that all the world is on real politics. Dr. Saab is hardcore realist, but I am neo-realist, believing in democracy, but doing everything that is justified in realism. Because, survival of the nation depends on their national interest as they determine. But we could not determine our national interest. We continue to follow the dictates that what are our national interests, and we are still doing that. When we think in terms of way forward, the relevancy, first thing, I believe that we should come out of Me Too policy, as Americans label us, that we always compete with India, though we have no competition with India. Obviously, in terms of survival, we are sharing 1,800-kilometer volatile threatened border. And that is the only reality. We are compromising all our interests on that altar. That is defended. And by the way, I don't think that I have capacity to criticize, but as a academician, I would certainly point out that we are focused on defense with India. And we have compromised everything, including the development in terms of politics, economy, and everything. But we are fighting a war with India on Kashmir, and we don't have developed, we never develop a mountain division to fight in a mountain region. Then what about the strategy? What we talk about the strategy? So the only thing we have to do is to make our house in order. As my colleagues, Ambassador Saab, as Dr. Nazir Saab pointed out, as Dr. Saab, economist coming from Peshawar, he mentioned that we don't have skilled labor. We don't have skilled labor is something different. You can give them degrees. I have seen in Gulf, as Dr. mentioned, coming from Qatar, that Pakistanis are the best labor there, and they appreciate. I wanted to listen that. I'm sorry. I have traveled the whole Gulf on my private tours. My half of the family is living there. So when I came across with the people, they are sick of Pakistanis. Their behavior, their arrogance, they refuse to do. This is not the time. I will not do. They are not trained to be submissive. उनकी वही वाली है कि ਅਸੀਂ ਜੱਟ ਹੁੰਨੇ ਆ ਸਾਡੀ ਜ਼ਮੀਨ ਹੈਗੀ ਹੈ ਤੇ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਕੀ ਕਿਸੇ ਦਾ so we do have our engineers are not able to work on ground level. My son, he is teaching finance in one of the leading university in Pakistan, and he is taking first time the course of financial management. He is ACCA part 1 and number of other degrees, MS finance. But he told me yesterday, Mama, I first time knew what is financial management. And he graduated from the top university of Pakistan, top university of this Islamabad. So we are not making the capacity of people we are sending abroad. We talk about diaspora. Everyone mentioned that the power of diaspora. But unskilled labor, how they are relevant in policy making of any country. I have seen people living in Saudi Arabia. Their daughters and sons are not in any institution. They are bus drivers, unskilled workers. How can they be relevant in policy making? And how can we compete with Indians? Every other restaurant, rather every restaurant is Indian restaurant. And they are so hospitable, so kind, so caring that manager and owners are standing on you and asking about the taste of food and discussing the food of Kerala and Delhi and Chandigarh and so. We don't have that skill and we don't need to. We think that we are important, people should come to us. That is not the way to do business. And we are more focused always on Kashmir, on finding similarities with Palestine. And Dr. Nazir mentioned the world has gone much beyond that. People are not concerned about, they are not happy with, they are not ready to listen on mantra with the Kashmir. What did concretely we did in that line? Nothing. And people say, I'm sorry, again, Dr. Saab said that we should speak truth. And we all do when we are sitting privately. Dr. Ambassador Excellency is sitting here. We are having hard debate. But we should convey it to the next generation. But एक Dr. Jaleel साहब हैं, कोई अमेरिका में पढ़ाते हैं, उनकी किताब भी है पाकिस्तान के ऊपर. He told me when he came first time to Pakistan back, he told that when I went to United States, I was very adamant that we won the 1965 war. There I got to know, no, you are not able to. On ground, on battleground, certainly Pakistan Army was a success, but on strategic level and obtaining goal, the war was not a success. And we never told our students. After 30 years, after 70 years, even we are telling the stereotypes. And we are not making capacity of our people to defend. It is not necessary. You see that if you see the relations between Japan and US, that was only a factory of atomic bomb. They are celebrating every year. But at the same time, they signed the first asymmetrical defense pact with United States that gave United States the charge of their security. Means उन्होंने उनको चौकीदार रख लिया और खुद डेवलपमेंट शुरू कर दी. हमने कभी ये सोचा ही नहीं. तो first we have to make our house order. हमें वो क्या चीजें भेजती हैं? हम बातें करते हैं कि हमें नॉन कन्वेंशनल चीजों पे, अभी डॉक्टर साहब ने मेंशन किया कि हम नॉन कन्वेंशनल एक्सपोर्ट पे बात करते हैं. We are not able to do even conventional exports. 25 साल पहले जिस वक्त हम अनारकली से स्टाइलों से जूता खरीदने जाते थे, वो मेड इन पाकिस्तान होता था. आज वो मेड इन ब्राजील होता है. किधर कॉन्टिनेंट है ब्राजील का? आप कसूर से जूता नहीं, चमड़ा नहीं मंगा सकते, वहां ब्राजील से जूता मंगा रहे हैं. ठीक है. अभी कल बात हो रही थी, हामी यहाँ बैठे हुए हैं, जवाद हामी, इनके प्रोग्राम में ये बात हो रही थी कि जी हम रशिया से गन्ना मंगवा रहे हैं और मंगवा सकते हैं. मतलब हमारी कन्वेंशनल एक्सपोर्ट्स क्या थी, हमारी स्ट्रेंथ क्या थी? हम अनाज घर थे ना बड़े सगीर का, तो हमारी कन्वेंशनल एक्सपोर्ट्स क्या थी? एग्रीकल्चर आइटम्स. तो हम गन्ना वहां से मंगा रहे हैं. आप यकीन जानेंगे दालें हम कनाडा से मंगा रहे हैं. तो हम कन्वेंशनल पे तो से हट गए और हमने सोचा कि हम इंडस्ट्रियलाइज हो जाए और हमने एग्रीकल्चर को अपने अबंडन कर दिया विदाउट रियलाइजिंग दैट एग्रीकल्चर इज द सोर्स ऑफ रॉ मटेरियल फॉर इंडस्ट्री, है ना. तो फिर हम गल्फ में कैसे रेलिवेंट हो सकते हैं? एनीवे, इतनी पेसिमिस्ट सिचुएशन नहीं है. थोड़ा सा हाउस इन ऑर्डर करने की जरूरत है, प्रायोरिटीज करने की जरूरत है. मिलिट्री रिलेशंस आर द बेस्ट एंड उसमें भी हमें इंडिया से कंपटीशन है, बहुत ज्यादा कंपटीशन है. تو جو ہم ان کو آفر کر رہے ہیں ہم اس میں تھوڑا سا اضافہ کر سکتے ہیں. انڈیا کا اس لیول پہ نہیں ہے جتنا پاکستان کا ہے, اس کے لیے تھوڑا سا ہمیں مارکیٹنگ کرنے کی ضرورت ہے. اگین کرتے بھی رہتے ہیں لیکن یہ کہ کچھ زیادہ کرنے کی ضرورت ہے. سیکنڈلی جو میرے سب کولیگس بات کریں, آئی وڈ ایمفسائز دیٹ اکنامک انٹرڈیپینڈنس. ہم پولیٹیکل لیوریجز لے ہی نہیں سکتے, پولیٹیکل ڈیویڈنڈس لے ہی نہیں سکتے جب تک ہم اکنامک انٹرڈیپینڈنس کریٹ نہیں کرتے. We started with strategic, we continued with strategic, we are intended to continue with strategic, جس میں ہمارا اب کوئی بھی لیوریج نہیں رہا جو انٹرنیشنل ریلیشنز میں ہوتا ہے. یور بارگین اسکل, یور لیوریج ٹو انفلوئنس ادرس, وہ آپ کے پاس کوئی نہیں ہے. تو یو ہیو ٹو کریٹ. آپ کا سی پیک موجود ہے, ڈاکٹر صاحب کہہ رہے ہیں کہ ایران کے ساتھ مٹیریلائز کریں. آئی وڈ سرٹنلی اپریشیٹ اینڈ آئی وڈ ڈس ایگری ود ڈاکٹر صاحب کہ اس کو جانا نہیں چاہیے تھا رشیا. میرا خیال ہے کہ پاکستان کو اپنی ساری چوائسیز اوپن رکھنی چاہیے اس وقت, کیونکہ انڈیا اور پاکستان نے اپنے رول سوائپ کر لیے ہیں جو شاید کولڈ وار کے زمانے میں تھے. تو اس وقت جو ہے وہ جتنے ڈیویڈنڈز انڈیا نے اپنی نان الائنمنٹ میں حاصل کیے تھے, دس از دا ٹائم دیٹ وی کین ارن بیک ناؤ. اور اب انڈیا جو ہے وہ کویڈ میں جائے اور کولڈ وار رائیولری میں پلے کرے اور اپنی اکانومی بھی تباہ کرے اور سوشل فیبرک بھی کرے ایز وی ڈیڈ ان دا پاسٹ. اور ہمارے پاس یہ ٹائم ہے کہ ہم اپنے سارے پالیسی چوائسیز اوپن کریں, ہم سب جگہ جائیں, ہم کسی جھگڑے میں نہ پڑیں, ہم سب جگہ پہ نیوٹرل رہیں. ٹرکی از گڈ فرینڈ اور ان کے انٹرسٹ ہمارے ساتھ جہاں کو انسائٹ کرتے ہیں وہ ہمیں سپورٹ کرتے ہیں, ہم بھی کرتے ہیں. اسی طرح سے گلف میں صرف ایک سعودی عربیہ نہیں ہے, ایک یو اے ای نہیں ہے. ہمارے ایمبیسڈر جیسے بھی مینشن کر رہے تھے, کویت میں بہت پوٹینشیل ہے, بحرین میں بہت پوٹینشیل ہے, ایون غریب سے غریب جیسا ایجپٹ میں بہت پوٹینشیل ہے. وی شوڈ ورک آن دیٹ. اور اس سے بھی باہر ایونیوز ہمیں دیکھنے چاہیے جس سے ایک انٹر ڈیپینڈنس ہماری ان کے ساتھ کریٹ ہو جائے. ہم ایک چیز پہ فوکس رہتے ہیں اور باقی چیزوں سے کان بند کر لیتے ہیں, کیونکہ ہماری ٹریننگ وہی ہے جو امریکنز کی ہوئی ہے نا. امریکن بھی ایک فارن پالیسی بناتے ہیں, اس کے بعد وہ اپنے کان ناک بند کر لیتے ہیں, دے کنٹینیو آن دیٹ فار 20 years. لیکن ہم 20 years نہیں, ہم 70 years سے وہیں پہ ہی ہیں. تو ہمیں سب سے پہلے اپنا, ہمارے پاس چیزیں کیا ہے دینے کے لیے, پہلے ہمیں اس کی ایک لسٹ بنانی ہے, پھر اس میں انکریز کرنا ہے. اور ہم چیزیں نہیں بنا سکتے تو وی کین بیکم اے پارٹ آف سپلائی چین. ہم بیچ میں اپنا ایک شیئر ڈال دیں اور وہاں پہ اپنا کام کر لیں. ہم اپنے انسٹیٹیوشنز کا لیول کریں. ہم فارن پالیسی میکنگ میں صرف ڈیفینس پہ نہ, آفٹر 1958 فارن پالیسی اینڈ ڈیفینس پالیسی سنونیم, یہ چیمہ صاحب نے اپنی بک میں لکھا. لیکن یہ کہ ہمیں اس میں فائنانس منسٹری کو بھی ڈال لینا چاہیے, ہمیں ایگریکلچر منسٹری کو بھی ڈال لینا چاہیے, ہمیں ایجوکیشن منسٹری کو بھی ڈال دینا چاہیے, ہمیں پلاننگ ڈویژن کو بھی ڈال دینا چاہیے, تاکہ ہم ہر لیول پہ آپریٹ کر سکیں. پہلے ہوتا تھا کہ آپ ابھی پلان کرتے ہیں اور 20 سال کے بعد آپ کو ریزلٹس ملتے ہیں. آپ ریزلٹس جو ہیں کمنگ ان سیکنڈز, and we have to be smart enough to get the dividends in seconds. اور یہ نہیں ہے کہ ہمارے پاس کیپیسٹی نہیں ہے, we are not utilizing our potential basically. تو ہمیں اگر اپنا پوٹینشیل سمجھ میں آ جائے تو عرب جو ہیں وہ والے عرب نہیں ہیں, اور کوئی بھی محبت اور احسان یاد نہیں رکھتا. اگر آپ انٹرنیشنل میں, کیونکہ بیسیکلی آئی واز گریجویٹ ان پولیٹیکل سائنس, تو میں بہت زیادہ ریلیٹ کرتی ہوں ڈومیسٹک پالیٹکس کو انٹرنیشنل پالیٹکس سے. وی آر working in an human environment, so our feelings and emotions are replicated at domestic and international level. تو ہم بھی, آپ کے بچے بھی آپ کا احسان نہیں یاد رکھتے جو آپ نے راتیں جاگ کے ان کو پالا ہوتا ہے اور پیٹ کاٹ کے ان کو پڑھایا ہوتا ہے. وہ جب بڑے ہوتے ہیں تو وہ یہ کہتے ہیں کہ یہ آپ کا فرض تھا. تو عربوں نے بھی ہمیں پے کیا ہے, وہ کہتے ہیں کہ ہم نے آپ کو پے کیا ہے نا, آپ we hired your services and we paid for. تو اب آپ کا کیا احسان ہے؟ تو احسان کسی کا بھی نہیں ہوتا. انٹرنیشنل ریلیشنز میں کوئی پرماننٹ فرینڈز اینڈ فوز نہیں ہوتے, اونلی دی انوائرمنٹ. یہ چانکیہ نے بہت پہلے انڈینز کو سکھا دیا, تو ہم نے کیوں نہیں سیکھا؟ ہمیں بھی تو پڑھنا لکھنا آتا ہے نا, ہمیں بھی سیکھنا چاہیے کہ ہمارا جو پوٹینشیل ہے وہ سب سے زیادہ ہے. صرف سسٹینیبل ریلیشنز جو ہیں وہ اکنامک ریلیشنز ہوتے ہیں. جہاں سے آپ کو بریڈ اینڈ بٹر آتا ہے وہ اب ہر بندہ جو ہم نے اکثر دیکھا ہمارے پٹھان جو کولیگس ہیں وہ بڑا لڑ پڑتے ہیں ایک دم نا, تو جب بات کرتے ہیں تو کہتے ہیں, اس کے بعد کہتے ہیں سوری میں کیونکہ پٹھان ہوں تو مجھے غصہ آ گیا. اس کو باس سے بات کرتے ہوئے غصہ کیوں نہیں آتا, وہ ڈین سے کیوں نہیں لڑ پڑتا, وہ ریکٹر سے کیوں نہیں لڑتا, ہمیشہ سبارڈینیٹ سے یا اسٹوڈنٹ سے کیوں لڑتا, اس لیے کہ جہاں سے اس کا بریڈ اینڈ بٹر آتا ہے, جہاں سے اس کی جاب سیکیور ہوتی ہے. تو وی شوڈ ورک آن اکنامک پوٹینشیل. Arabs are more materialistic, much more materialistic than ever, and they are opening opportunities. Golden visa دے رہے ہیں, 10 سال کے لیے دے رہے ہیں, IT graduates کو دے رہے ہیں, foreign PhDs کو دے رہے ہیں, یہاں پہ بھی کام کرتے ہیں. وہ بھی کسی زمانے میں ہم سمجھتے تھے we never applied for immigration, حالانکہ ہم گھر میں 2 PhDs تھے اور ایک ہفتے میں کرا لیتے. لیکن میں اب سمجھتی ہوں کہ you can serve your nation anywhere. تو آپ جہاں پہ بھی بیٹھے ہیں you can make a difference if you have that potential. جہاں پہ آپ کھڑے ہو جائیں وہاں پہ آپ اپنی نیشن کو پروٹیکٹ کر سکتے ہیں. So we should work on that. Marketing is very important. Grabbing opportunity is very important. گھر بیٹھ کے بہت ہائیلی کوالیفائڈ لوگ ان کی کوئی مارکیٹنگ نہیں ہو رہی ہوتی تو ظاہر ہے کہ وہ پھر اسی طرح ہی بیٹھ جاتے ہیں, انہیں جاب نہیں ملتی. ان گلف وی ہیو ٹو, ابھی میسٹر صاحب نے کہا کہ ہمیں ہائی لیول ایکسچینجز کرنے چاہیے, obviously کرنے چاہیے, لیکن وی شوڈ ایکسچینج پیپلز ٹو پیپلز ریلیشنز. اور تھوڑے دن پہلے ہم بات کر رہے تھے مڈل ایسٹ کی میٹنگ میں, تو ایک پوٹینشیل جو سعودی عربیہ میں ہے, دے آر لبرلائزنگ, وہ کنسرٹ کروا رہے ہیں سلمان خان کا. تو ہمارے پاس بھی بڑا اسمارٹ فواد خان ہے, اور اگر وہ کرا رہے ہیں انڈین ایکٹریسز کا تو ہماری ایکٹریسز بھی بڑی اوپن ہے, ہمیں انہیں دبا دبا کے رکھنا پڑتا ہے, وہاں بھیجتے ہیں آرام سے جو مرضی کریں, ہے نا. سو وی شوڈ کانٹیکٹ پروموٹرس, we should conduct our own concerts, we should have peoples to peoples relations. اور ڈاکٹر صاحب جو کہہ رہے تھے ابھی کہ گلف میں بہت پیپلز ٹو پیپلز لیول پہ پاکستانیوں کے لیے ریسیپشن ہے, we should encash that. اور اب پہلے یہ تھا کہ لوگوں کا انفلوئنس نہیں تھا, obviously dictatorship is prevailing, لیکن اس وقت ایسا نہیں ہے since they are liberalizing. So people's influence is there on policy making. I have met with number of parliamentarians of Saudi Arabia, though وہ elected نہیں ہیں, nominated ہیں, but since they are in مشاورت, وہ involved ہیں, تو they can they interact with each other, with us. اور جب پاکستان آتی ہیں تو وہ کہتی ہیں کہ ہمیں ایسے والے دوپٹے لا دو, ہم اس سے والے سے تنگ ہو گئے ہیں, تو ہم ان کو لا دیتے ہیں, بہت اچھے اچھے مارکیٹ سے دوپٹے ملتے ہیں, بہت اچھے ان کو لا دیتے ہیں. تو that is cultural exchange, influence, and that would impact on their thoughts as well. ٹھیک ہے, تو ہمیں اس کے اوپر کام کرنا چاہیے. اپنی کیپیسٹی بلڈنگ کریں, دین کلچرل ایکسچینج کریں, اکنامک انٹرڈیپینڈنس پیدا کریں, اور کنونشنل موڈس پہ ریلائی کرنا بند کر دیں. کنونشنل موڈز ہماری ڈپلومیسی بہت اسٹرانگ رہی, لیکن دیٹ واز پیرالائز انڈر دا پالیسی ڈکٹیٹس میڈ بائی دا گورنمنٹ. سول ملٹری ریلیشنز کو ہمیں تھوڑا سا اوپن کرنے کی ضرورت. ملٹری کو اپنا ہاؤس میں رہنے کے لیے, اپنے ایریا پہ اسٹریٹجک پہ ڈیفینس پہ سجیشن دینے کے لیے بہت ضروری ہے ان کی موجودگی, لیکن باقی جو ایونیوز ہیں انہیں ہمیں اوپن کر دینا چاہیے. ایگریکلچر کو, پھر فائنینس کو, ایجوکیشن کو, پیپلز ٹو پیپلز ریلیشنز کو ہمیں دوسری منسٹرز کو ان کو ڈیلیگیٹ کر دینا چاہیے. ہمیشہ کے لیے نہ دیں, بے شک بعد میں واپس لے لیں, لیکن ابھی ڈیلیگیٹ ضرور کر دیں فار دا ٹائم بینگ ٹو میک یور پلیس. اور یو آر آلویز ویلکم ان گلف اور ایوری ویئر with these outfits, especially for reserved for Pakistanis. تو ہم وہ اس کے اوپر کام کریں اور ایک چین پیدا کریں, اور پھر یہ نہیں کہ آج کریں اور 2 دن کے بعد ختم کر دیں. That is a permanent process that should continue for at least a decade, جس میں ہم اپنے جو اسٹیریوٹائپ ہے کشمیر, پیلسٹائن, افغانستان, ان پہ بھی کام کرتے رہیں, لیکن ان پہ فوکس کرنے کے ساتھ پیرل اپنی اکانومی, اپنے کلچرل اور پیپلز ٹو پیپلز ریلیشن جائے. Then we will be relevant in Gulf, otherwise we will be obsolete. ہمیں کوئی پہچانے گا ہی نہیں. ہم یہ ضرور بتائیں گے کہ یہ جو سڑک ہے یہ ہمارے ٹھیکیدار نے بنائی تھی, تو اگلے کہیں گے جو کھڈا ہے اس میں تمہارے ٹھیکیدار کی وجہ سے. ٹھیک ہے نا. سو وی ہیو ٹو بی ویجیلنٹ اباؤٹ آور پریزنس, بیکاز nothing is sustainable in international relations unless you continue to work on that. अगर आप करते रहेंगे। हम कल बात कर रहे थे कि 1971 में जो आपकी कैपेसिटी थी ऑफ डूइंग मीडिएशन बिटवीन चाइना एंड यूएस, एंड यू टेक द क्रेडिट एंड अमेरिकन्स गेव द क्रेडिट, और जो हेनरी किसिंजर ने डिप्लोमा में अपनी बुक में लिखा, तो उसने कहा कि वी आर इंडेप्टेड टू पाकिस्तानीज for 100 years. और 4 साल के बाद the same person gave this threat to Mr. Bhutto that if you will pursue your nuclear policy, we will make you example. तो 4 साल, अगर 3 साल के बाद दुनिया बदल गई, 4 साल के बाद बदल गई, तो we are talking about 50-40 years back. किस दुनिया में रहते हैं? हमें उससे बाहर आ जाना चाहिए और इंटरनेशनल रिलेशंस के पैटर्न्स पे चलना चाहिए। अपने आप को रेलेवेंट बनाएंगे। हम हमेशा अपनी स्ट्रेटेजिक लोकेशन की बात करते हैं और दुनिया को अपने पीछे पड़वा लेते हैं कि हम बड़ी इंपॉर्टेंट स्ट्रेटेजिक पोजीशन पे। वी आर मच मोर देन दैट, वी डू हैव पोटेंशियल मच मोर देन दैट, द स्ट्रेटेजिक पोजीशन, एंड वी शुड एनकैश दैट, एंड वी शुड रियलाइज फर्स्ट आवरसेल्फ एंड देन सेल इट टू अदर्स, and that is the most attractive thing. India की तरफ सब इसलिए जाते हैं कि that is most attractive market. Obviously they are 5 times bigger to Pakistan, but we are still 20 million people, है ना? और इतने ज्यादा लोग हैं, 200 million people, 200 million people, they are not a joke, है ना? तो उसमें ये कि we are smarter, we are presentable, we are intelligent, and we can make our place. First, find out the areas of convergence, then work on that, and always the area of convergence is one, social relation, and second, economic relations, and that provide the basis for strategic and political relations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Amna, for your remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now proceed with the question and answer session. I would request to whoever does have a question, please do state your name, the organization you're affiliated with, and the panelists you choose to pose your question to. Can we have a show of hands, please? Questions? Ji, sir.
My name is Ikramul Haq Sayyed. Currently, I'm a trainer at the Ministry of Defense. When I was listening to all the worthy panelists, they were all showing the gaps and disconnects. Really good, really marvelous in terms of formulating the policy. So sitting under the roof where policy making is the core aspect. So I would like to say that I was thinking where to start from. If we are going for a sustainable relationship between the Gulf and Pakistan, what will be the starting point? You know, at this point, I would like to put my humble request is that we should revamp the entire diplomatic missions of Pakistan in every Gulf state. Now, with due respect, we don't need, as Rama Mahmood said, conventional ambassadors. We need portfolio managers. We need people who can think on the different venues and open up the people-to-people, business-to-business, and the rest of the channels for Pakistan in order to sustain the relationships. Our mission should not be just a ceremonial kind of a setup. It should be proactively thinking about what next and how to mitigate the particular risk and how to cash on particular opportunity that lies within that particular arena. And that can only be done when there is a one-to-many relationship. That's where I'll say we have to, NAFA has to revamp the entire concept of a ceremonial-based Pakistan mission with a person who will be just there for 3 years. No, there has to be a continuity. And the word that came to my mind, it should be a strategic enterprise unit of Pakistan, not just a mission of Pakistan. It should be a strategic enterprise unit who should be working day and night in order to develop the value chain and get all the things connected. As I always said in my trainings, all ends. Men, machine, material, money, method, market, management. We need to look at this thing, then we will be able to say the relationships are on the good footing. If you look at the footprints of our Gulf-Pakistan relationships, they were good. Currently, they have shown a downward curve or a very steep downward curve. The only problem is we have not been able to look into the contemporary management style of building the relationships. So my humble request under this roof is, whenever the policymakers are formulating a policy, they should be looking into the contemporary management practices, contemporary way of engagement with, like, just like the MNCs do. The overseas operations are always there with a person who is a portfolio manager. That's a management term. So a portfolio is something that needs to be looked into while developing a relationship. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your remarks, sir. Would any one of our panelists want to add to that?
I just want to kind of respond to something that was said. So I got 4 academic degrees in political science. So important is because, yes, politics is about interests, but let's define those interests. They're not set in stone as if I say this statement and everyone understands exactly what I mean. Those interests are based on values, and those values need to be explicated. Those values need to be defined. And yes, while those values are changing, to take a superficial look at the region might show you a false reality. The truth is, Qatar has a very deep ideological relationship with Turkey, has a very deep relationship with Malaysia, has a very deep relationship with Singapore, by the way. So although these relationships, yes, they share a particular vision and a view of how the region should emerge, not for the 5 or 10 years, but for the next 50 years. And Qatar has resisted pressures to alter that. And this is not to say there are not behind the door meetings. There are always behind the door meetings with everybody, enemies and friends. But nevertheless, I would say that if you do look politically at certain countries, there is a clear vision, and that vision should be based on values. And those values do not necessitate that, okay, then whatever is good for me now in this immediate 5 years, or what I think may be good for me now, I'll pursue even if it's for my long-term disadvantage. That's not what is political realism. And those are not your teachers, are they? Is knowledge neutral? Most knowledge is extremely jaded, in particular cultural awareness, like political realism. Political realism means that you can sign an agreement. If you call yourself a political realism, I'm telling you as an academic who teaches political realism, that if you believe in political realism, that means I can sign an agreement with you and break it the next day. Now, as a moral, ethical being, do you believe that? And should you? Is that the legacy you want to carry forward? And is that the truth that you want to abide by? Then you should have no problem in someone cheating you. And if the world follows that, then what kind of anarchy do you have? This is exactly what people follow, by the way. So there's no illusion that this is not what people are following, but the illusion is that you must follow that way too. Aren't you here to offer a different alternative perspective? Or are you here just to follow everybody else? Just also to be in that jungle, a part of it? Or are you here to set a different standard? So the choice, that's why I said very clearly that people's worldview and paradigm shapes them. But make sure you get a good reading of how it is, not a superficial one, to really understand what that entails. You know the quote by Morgenthau, and he's one of the main authorities on political realism in the modern times, as well as Machiavelli. By the way, Machiavelli ripped off his book. It's a theft. The original text by Machiavelli was written by Muhammad al-Saqili in the 12th century in Sicily. And it was actually a little bit differently named the Manual of Just Leadership for the Moral Prince. The prince that follows akhlaq. And then he had the same values as Machiavelli. It's very interesting to look at how Machiavelli ripped off this Arabic treatise, translated into Latin, became so popular, but every reference to God, every reference to Had se zyada nahi jana, khayal rakhna, that even when you are using subterfuge and other tactics that are allowed in warfare, that you don't cross the limits. A greater sophistication than just saying I can cheat anybody and break any law. Is that what you want your legacy to be? And is that what you're going to stand for? So I would encourage, and I respect everyone's opinion. I humbly differ from some of the opinions expressed, but get a deeper reading and read them yourself. Read the actual text properly, right? So Urdu is not my first language. I don't understand a lot of what I'm hearing. And some of the things, I'm frankly surprised by some of the things that I'm hearing. But nonetheless, just like we started today with Iqra, then read properly and read in depth. And I am sure if you read enough, not superficially, you'll come to the right conclusions.
Thank you so much. I just want to respond the suggestion that the contemporary management practices be followed. I tell you, you decide whatever the way you want. You pick the brilliant person from Pakistan and appoint an ambassador. But how he will sell on the strength of the country. If suppose you are sending a person to country A, he will talk to them. He will say that, okay, we are ready to provide you manpower, but then the manpower, the institutions which are supposed to train them, they are not ready to train them properly. They are not providing them. Your strength, ambassador can speak on the strength of the country. If the strength is not there, your house is not in order, then the ambassador cannot, talk in a vacuum. When they say, what about militancy? What about extremism in Pakistan? How you are handling it? If we are not handling it properly, then ambassador cannot say, oh, we are doing perfectly fine. So we are handling it properly. So I think as you see the political saying that the domestic policy is also a reflection, the foreign policy is a reflection of domestic policy. So we also need to put our house in order, and then reforms are important. Yes, the foreign ministry should also took note of such reforms, but reforms can be done, but it cannot be done in isolation. So I think it's both way. My opinion is that not that I'm I have the business association with the foreign ministry, but the important thing is that recently we sent a journal to Saudi Arabia, and you have seen in a few months that he's being replaced, not delivered, because we have to work on the strength of the country, and the country's strength is unfortunately is not there. We are going day by day on the weaker side. Thank you so much.
Osama, please.
Thank you very much. Dr. Wapa, I have a question for you. You spoke about coming up with ways to create ease of doing business for investors from the Gulf countries. Towards that end, I wanted to ask you, what are some of the impediments in our framework towards the unease of doing business that can be done away with to invite investments from the region? Secondly, I wanted to ask you, what are other areas that we can invite investment from the Gulf countries in special economic zones? Like, what are some of the competitive areas that where Gulf investors would be interested in investing within these SEZs? And at the same time, what are some of the incentives that Pakistan can offer to that end? So if you could just highlight some of these areas.
Thank you. I think three things here. One is to bank on the capacity and potential of Pakistani diaspora abroad. They are the easiest to bring. Up until now, and I think we have seen rising registrations as per SCCP numbers. In at least 2 of the provinces, there's been a startup revolution, literally.
Whether the firms will bring in or whether the firms will sustain, that's another question. But the firm registration has shown an uptick despite of COVID. And most of that was on the back of those Pakistanis who wanted to invest some part of their savings over here in emerging sectors. And of course, IT, ICT, telemedicine, EdTech being some of them, of course. The second thing is with regards to those investors who, for example, are keen to tap into large domestic demand. These investors lie in sectors such as FMCGs, fast-moving consumer goods. They have to come anyways. The BMWs, the Audis, they are looking at the 5th largest country in the world, right? So they want that kind of demand. Now, for them, the easiest way is to do a joint venture, where you have a strong local matchmaking taking place, and a strong local business group eases them into Pakistani market. This is what we have seen recently in the case of Hyundai. They have installed the plant. A Chinese car maker has installed the plant. Almost all of them didn't had to navigate their way into the complex business processes that we have, just because they had a very good JVO. Now, the last thing is those investors who don't want to come through JV, they have their own sets of code of conduct, how they operate. They come in, they directly want to register their own entity as a Pakistani chapter. Now, for them, of course, we need to follow the same path which we have been doing under Pakistan Regulatory Modernization Initiative. We have to make those 126 agenda items under reducing cost of doing business goal that the government has set for itself. Really need to expedite in those areas. I think most of those areas relate to the second part of your question, which is how do we mobilize the potential of SEZs? So in case of Rashakai, for example, comparing it with Faisalabad, in Faisalabad it didn't take much because plug and play was there. So the entire land parcel was sold within days. But now the other story in Faisalabad is that those companies want to scale up, and we have infrastructure deficits. So it is now taking 8 to 10 months to supply them with the scale up electricity connection, for example, because we have these infrastructure deficits. But in case of Rashakai, the situation was completely different, that you had to convince people that here you have another destination where you should come. It is by the motorway. By the way, it has that potential. It has taken much longer. It has taken almost 4.5 years to bring the first Chinese steel manufacturer to come and start work in Rashakai. So I'm sure all provinces will have their own way of doing things. But even in this case, for example, you have to see that some of the provincial BOIs, Board of Investments, are more proactive than others. So some benchmarking, role of benchmarking is here. I'm sure if, for example, Dhabeji is let's say, lagging behind, they have some things to pick up from, let's say, Punjab BOI or Khyber Pakhtunkhwa BOI, and then take it forward. But huge potential even for non-China investment in these SEZs. Our land is one of the cheapest. So in case of Faisalabad, we have sold the land. Unlike many of the SEZs abroad, we are willing to sell the land in the name of the foreign owner. This is the kind of facility that rarely you see in developing countries.
Thank you, Dr. Bakar. Ishtiaq, sir.
So much. My name is Ishtiaq Ali Mehri. I belong to the IPRIS Publication Department. My question is to Dr. Farhan. My first question is that, I can relate to what you have said. As you mentioned, towards Pakistan. And my second question is to Your Excellency, Mr. Ambassador. Moves to bring back the illegally stashed money in UAE, and there have been agreements also on that. And you also mentioned about the $10 billion, the minimum $10 billion that are sitting in UAE. Has there been any concrete move to bring that back? Has that really surfaced? And do you think that Gwadar is emerging as another bone of contention between UAE and Pakistan?
So I think fantastic question. All right, and like I said, I've been there for 14 years, so I've been mixing with people in the Diwan and high levels of government. So I have a pretty good understanding of what they're saying. And I'm at the university, and the university is almost 40,000 students. University. Over of it is right. So you get a pretty good idea of just what people are thinking, their attitudes, their general assessment towards Pakistan. Although I'll disagree with some of the other assessments here, I can tell you my experience with Qatari young people at Qatar University, perceptions of Pakistan, right? Many of you may know the adopted son of the father Emir was also Pakistani. And when the father Emir, Sheikh Hamad, was sick, he gave his kidney to him. So every Qatari knows that the adopted son of the father Emir gave his kidney to improve the health of Sheikh Tamim's father, right? Now, during that crisis, I believe did a brilliant move not to take the side of Saudi Arabia and the UAE during the quartet, and also not get involved in Yemen. I want to share a perception. You know, you can look out a window and you can see the sky, or you can look out that perspective. So a lot of what you're going to be listening to universities is perspective. It's not, it's perspective. And if anything, it's truth with a little t. So the 1.7 Pakistanis in UAE, the now nearly 180 Pakistanis in Qatar, and the soon to be 240 plus that are going to be there, or the amount, I think it's almost 3 million in Saudi Arabia, then this is not a favor someone does to you. This is not a favor. And it's very important you realize that. Like the West to chant this pathetic mantra of immigrants should be grateful. It's false. It's not true. Every indicator shows that immigrants are the and most productive members of society. They pay the most taxes. They do the jobs that others don't do. That's the purpose behind migration. And we're not even talking about applications, right? The applications to migrate to the West run into the thousands of dollars per application. And there are hundreds of thousands of applications every month. Just imagine that net outflow of people from poor countries trying to go to the land of what they think. So that's a major thing I want to kind of include in this analysis, is that don't think that someone's doing you a favor by bringing your people to work. They need work. No, they couldn't survive without that work. And coming to how Pakistan handled it, and the street talk is that I thought it was, of course, very appreciative. Just look at the statistics that Dr. Muqat gave. And this is all since 2018 afterwards. You can see the jump. I was there when Prime Minister Imran Khan came to Qatar. They rented out a stadium for him. It was the first time ever that I was ever witness to tens of thousands of people. The stadium was inside was packed and outside was packed. That's how many people. And that's what kind of respect the people responded to the leadership of this country within Qatar. So they appreciated the role. I think Pakistan did try to play a mediator role at that time, but of course it wasn't very successful, right? But nonetheless, the way it managed it by not siding I think is a really important decision. There is not just Saudi Arabia and UAE, and although, yes, they're the major beneficiaries, but like I said, they benefit from Pakistani workers that are hardworking, that don't steal, by and large, that don't create the facade. So they are a benefit to society. And I gave you, that's my opinion. I gave you what happened in front of me with the Minister of Labor and the deputy head. I'm just honestly sharing with you what he said to me, right? That's what I'm sharing. Now you can take it or leave it. But nonetheless, that's what happened to me. I'm not giving you my opinion of going on vacation and what I felt like something happened. This is what this person said. And I'll share with you what the students are sharing with me about their positive thoughts. But one more thing I do want to add, because I live outside, I'm born and raised in Canada. My whole life I spent in America, Canada, and the UK. I false perception of what India's perception is. They have this kind of mythical idea that India is somehow on this higher plane. And it is exactly the opposite. As a matter of fact, they're ridiculed and they're mocked, even in cartoons, in the most famous cartoons like Simpson. They're mocked. So but it's interesting when I come here and I hear people talk like that. I'm like, that's not the reality in Canada or in America or in Europe. At least not according to, I'm from there and I haven't seen it. But I hope I addressed how they did it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me also comment on the neutrality of Pakistan and the mediation. When this decision was taken by Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, and Bahrain to cut the diplomatic relations with Qatar, and also they took extra step that airspace was also closed, and it was very, very tough for Qatar. And I remember I was in Kuwait at that time, and the Emir of Kuwait did play a very, very active role. He, although in very old age, he visited Saudi Arabia and he tried to mediate and tried to ask them to soften it. But he could not succeed. Pakistan also tried, and I remember there was a meeting in the Prime Minister Secretariat at that time. Some ambassadors from outside also invited. I was also there in that meeting. So Pakistan was trying to play a mediatory role. Then suddenly a visit was planned for Riyadh, and our Prime Minister went there, but there was an apprehension before going. What about if the Saudi Arabia said, okay, join us? What will be our response? So these things were debated, and Pakistan prepared its response that, okay, we will not side, but at the same time, we will try whatever role we can. But the signal from the Gulf was that this is a Gulf issue, so please, you see, stay away. But at the same time, they did not put pressure on Pakistan to follow them in cutting diplomatic relations with on your other question, bringing money back, you see, the NAB obviously initiate the process of any case, and when they have investigation, then they seek some information from UAE. When they seek information, if the legal process has been completed from here, the UAE government do cooperate. But most of the cases are not fully cooked, and they ask them and they find so many legal hitches that, okay, how can we provide this information? I remember that 2-3 references came when I was there, and we did ask UAE government to provide some information. And in some cases, they did provide. Our team also went to Dubai. They had some details, discussions with the local authorities. So sometimes they do provide, but at the same time, it is also in their interest, and the money is privately invested, not the government money. Government money has not been invested in those projects. So I think this is a very delicate thing. But if they ask some information, they do provide. On Gwadar, yes, there is a sense of competition. Yes, Because if Gwadar is fully developed and whatever we have envisaged that Gwadar should play a role, it will be a challenge for Dubai port. It will be a challenge because that is also free port, and if we also declare free port, so there will be. So certainly there is a competition there.
So, yeah, we are talking about, bringing money back. And since the years NAP is working, and we have assessed that we don't have that capacity to even get money out of those who are declared corrupt out of this process. So we can think out an out-of-box solution that we can formalize that investment in other countries. And as FBR was working on tax collection procedures, and ultimately they were satisfied on a self-assessment pro forma that people, and that certainly raised the level of tax collection in Pakistan. So we can bring them in formal economy and impose taxation on them. In fact, that investment is bringing remittance in Pakistan in informal terms. So we should think in terms of that as well. That is my opinion. Maybe
Offshore company.
I just have one quick point right? Just to kind of highlight something, right? Again, because I think this is such a pervasive idea, meaning it's so widespread and it's so false, that let's suppose that somebody is subscribing to the ideology of political realism, which is premised on the idea that there's no morality or ethics. If that's true, can we hold anybody accountable for anything? Can you really blame someone for stealing and stashing $10+ billion of money? Or as we know, the well-known case of the person from Wapta, that was a crime, and they ran away from the country and ended up, I think, somewhere in Toronto. All of these crimes, we call them crimes on the premise that they are immoral or unethical. So if you minus that, or if you no longer believe in that ethical framework, right? First, I think it's Ghar Islami. But if you don't want to abide by that, then if you don't consider it ethical, like you would anywhere, then you have no right to castigate or criticize anybody else for stealing your water, for killing the innocent people, for setting bombs off in Balochistan or in Karachi or in Lahore. Then the whole entire edifice and premise by which you will criticize anybody else, it evaporates, right?
Thank you. With no further questions, I'd now like to invite Acting President Tipri for his closing remarks.
Thanks, Waleed. There's not much to close after such a long and expansive debate. I think everything has been said, but I'll just echo a couple of points that were made by the speakers themselves. Very important point came up with both Dr. Nazir Saab and Dr. Amna about creating internal resilience. I mean, if we want to establish good relationship with Gulf, we need to create our own business environment so that people come and do business with us. And same was echoed by Dr. Waqar once he reminded us that we need a lot to do to ease our business practices. And once we were having a round table with USIP, so they also told us that there is a lot to be done on account of easing our business practices, lowering our tariff barriers, one window operations, and regulatory checks to make them simple. So those things are adequately understood. Speaking on internal resilience, I remember as I was sitting there, a quote came back to me made in 1993, once we were doing staff course in Command and Staff College, Quetta. Is one of the bastions of military education for all army officers. General Jangir Karamat, then Chief of Army Staff, he had come and delivered a talk. So a quote struck me, and that was that you cannot project your strengths as a country from a base with exploitable vulnerabilities. So each time I think it encapsulates so much wisdom that your own house is not in order, and how can you project the strengths when your base can be exploited? So this is the thing we need to internalize. Very enlightening debate by Mr. Chuck on values and interests. Interestingly, when I saw him first and was about to shake hands, I was reminded of my professor in Canada, in Toronto, when I was doing my master's, Professor Adam Chapnick. He's a big one on middle path diplomacy and congruence of interests and values. So his thesis was basically that, look, there are two neighbors who are joined by a girdle, Canada and United States. Both have different interests and many ways similarities. But the difference is that United States follows its interests, and it's an interest-based system, whereas the Canada is value-based systems, peace, order, prosperity, and the responsibility to protect that we keep parroting ad nauseum and service at various forums. RTP is a Canadian concept. The values, we may have different interests. Gulf is changing. There's a new generation coming up. There was a generation which had born and brought up in Pakistan. Most had lived in Karachi. Most had been, groomed in Pakistani banks. But now entirely a new, different generation is coming up. But a substratum of those values still prevails. I'll give you a small example. I was 2009. So I was in Canadian Forces College, Toronto, doing a national war course. And in one of the talks, I remember Brzezinski came up then from the United States as a guest speaker. And at the end of the discourse, there was something on Palestinian-Israeli problem. Most of the Canadians' voices were muted for obvious reasons. So I stood up at the end and gave a expansive tour de horizon of what the problem was. And after that, I forgot about the whole thing. We had lunch and came back. So after the lunch, I saw our UAE friend, Colonel Falasi, ambling up to me. And I never, earlier interacted with him in such detail. And he came up to me and said, "Sir, I have come to congratulate you and to thank you." So I forgot about the whole thing. I said, "For what?" He said that you spoke about Palestinians and Arabs, and I'm genuinely thankful, and I want to host a dinner for you. So that was a shock for me. Obviously, he couldn't say those things in front of Canadians, but he said those things. So this is the value, despite the interest thing, varying here and there. This is the substratum of values and goodwill that Gulf still has, and we need to capitalize upon that. And we need not be bothered about Indian diaspora. We know there are 250 million Muslims in India. We are 200 and more than that. So let them also have good relations, but we must also capitalize on our strengths and look positively toward this Gulf relations. So I thank you all for a very expansive debate, and we look forward to this interaction in the future as well.
Thank you, sir. Before we do conclude this session, there are mementos that I request the acting president to present to our esteemed speakers. So just a brief ceremony. Dr. Mujahid, Chuck, if you could please. Sir. Dr. Bakar. Ambassador Ghulam Dastagir. Dr. Nazir. Dr. Amna, please. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That brings us to the conclusion of today's seminar on Pakistan Gulf relations. I thank you all for your active participation. have lunch arranged for our speakers in the mini conference rooms. So we do have lunch arranged for our speakers in the conference room, the mini conference